Hi, everyone. I'm Andrew Chong. I'm a PhD candidate at the UC Berkeley School of Information, and I'll be presenting our paper, Perceptions of Fairness in Technology-Mediated Marketplaces, co-authored with Jisoo Yu and Coye, Cheshire. So I think many of us have had experiences with food delivery apps where we ask questions like, how much should I tip? How does my tip affect how the driver is paid? And does my tip actually benefit the company in some way? So this sort of ambiguity really came to a head in 2019, where DoorDash's guaranteed minimum tipping policy at the time received a lot of criticism. So under the policy, drivers did not always receive their tips in full. Drivers who received a below average tip actually received a top up from DoorDash, and drivers who got an above average tip actually saw their base pay reduced. So after this investigative report by Andy Newman came out, DoorDash got a lot of pushback from consumers. So if you were to tip your driver $10, for example, not the full $10 would appear for the driver. And this went against consumer expectations of what a tip was and where a tip should go. So this experience of tipping is just one example of the gaps that can emerge between consumer expectations and how marketplaces operate. We as consumers increasingly interact with other economic actors through marketplace environments that are managed by third parties. And we describe these as technology-mediated marketplaces, environments constructed and managed with code where third parties structure recurrent exchange between buyers and sellers. So we are using tipping and third-party food delivery to examine how consumers think about and participate in TMMs. And our base RQs are how do consumers describe what is or is not fair when tipping in third-party food delivery compared to tipping in non-TMM environments? And second, what role do TMM companies play for consumers in determining what is or is not fair when tipping in third-party food delivery? And I think underlying this intuitively, we are asking, do consumers think about fairness in tipping differently in TMMs? And what aspects of technological mediation affect how consumers think about tipping? So in terms of methods, we interviewed 25 users recruited through the Berkeley X Lab. These were in-depth interviews up to 90 minutes in length. We recruited users to be distributed evenly between 4 different age groups and between people who identified as female and male. And we asked participants explicitly to compare tipping in third-party food delivery and non-mediated contexts. And we were interested in the attitudes, motivations, and beliefs around fairness and tipping of the participants. In terms of data analysis, we went through a process of accepting. We did a first cycle of initial and in vivo coding, and then multiple iterations of pattern coding to finally end up with the 3 major themes that I will discuss. So these themes are what we found in the data, which I'll go through one by one. So first, fairness as providing a living wage. I think many of us based in the United States will be familiar with this, that service workers depend on tips to make a large component of their wages. So what really stood out here is there was a lot of ambiguity and uncertainty in how much to tip. So for someone like P14, he talks about how he wants to play by the rules, but when the rules are kind of vague, he doesn't know what to do. He just wants to pay and get what he's supposed to get and not have to play the game. And for someone like P5, he felt that consumers shouldn't be asked to police these environments. To him, he's just buying some food and it shouldn't be up to him to make sure that the tipping is implemented correctly. Another aspect that came up is a lack of interaction and connection between consumers and drivers. So P10 here talks about how you have the option to tip before you're told your driver's name, before you know anything about the driver, and how that makes it feel like she has no connection to them. P3 actually talked about her experiences before and post-COVID. So she talks about how she actually used to chat to drivers and actually tipped them more if she felt they were having a bad day. But how that aspect of tipping had been removed by the pandemic, how she doesn't have the personal interaction or perception of someone else's situation, uh, especially due to contactless delivery policies post-COVID. And another aspect that affected how participants feel about drivers. So P22 talks about how, to him, to some extent, the drivers are interchangeable. He talks about how Uber and Grubhub are always going to find a driver, and compared to the restaurants and the restaurant owners, he feels just less connection with them, and he actually sees the drivers as part of this machine, which are these large institutions. So fairness is reciprocity. I think many of us are familiar with this, the idea that tipping is based on rewarding or reciprocating the work and effort of the service worker. And P2 puts it here as having an interaction that you observe and then tipping based on that. So what really stood out here in our data is how the sequence of tipping really affected whether tipping is viewed as reciprocal in nature. So P15 talks about how because the payment part happens before she gets her food, she just does it before delivery and is not influenced by her experience, and how that meant that she had a tendency to tip the same all the time rather than calibrating her tip based on performance. Another aspect that really stood out is accountability and conflation of responsibility, both between drivers and restaurants, as well as drivers in the app. So there were a few incidents. This is one of them where P22 talks about how he tipped a driver poorly because of an incorrect order. And so in the moment itself, he felt there needed to be some kind of consequence, and how he was angry in the moment. But during the interview itself, he talked about how he never really thought about it, but the driver and the restaurant are actually separate entities and not connected, as he puts it. And so he ends up thinking that because something went wrong, he feels like he needs to punish somebody, and he ends up punishing the driver. And another aspect that stood out is how the app can facilitate more detached interaction. So P25 talks about how she would actually ignore phone calls from drivers to avoid leaving her apartment. And after these experiences, she would actually avoid further interacting with the driver. So she would say stuff like, leave the food at the door through the app. And to her, this sort of inconvenience is not worth complaining about, as she puts it. For her, she feels like it's just part of their work. So finally, the third theme is fairness in how TMM companies distributed payments, including tips and fees between drivers, restaurants, and the TMM companies. So I think a lot of the participants were very aware of the additional fees and costs that they were asked to pay. And P11 talked about how, because they're already paying many fees, he actually felt less inclined to tip. And there were also participants talking about how restaurants also pay fees. So some participants were aware of that, and they felt that the TMM company was taking money from every person in the equation, is how P23 put it. So especially interesting about this is that consumers incorporated the role of TMM companies in different ways. So for P1, he actually chose to tip third-party food delivery drivers less than a driver employed by a mom and pop shop, because he felt that tipping drivers, third-party food delivery drivers, will end up benefiting a corporation, or as he puts it, he doesn't want to help out whoever the new CEO of Uber is. And then on the other hand, someone like P23 felt that because there's this tech company in the middle now, people just need to get used to paying more. So for the discussion, I want to talk about aspects of TMMs that stood out to us and that really complicated the ability of people to act fairly in TMMs, and also talk about how the design of TMMs can shape how consumers relate to workers. So first off, I think one of the standout results is how by codifying the decision to tip before delivery, the social meaning of tipping really changed for consumers. So participants describe how they view the tip less as an act of reciprocity and more as an obligation to provide a living wage. And I think in the literature, we've seen how there's a shift in the gig economy from this more sharing economy notion that encourages social exchange and reciprocity towards a more transactional model based on efficiency and convenience. And what our study highlights is how such a shift can take place around tipping and food delivery. And then second, consumer perceptions of TMM companies as for-profit third-party mediators. So participants in our sample were very aware that decisions were taking place in this environment that was visible and evaluated by a third-party company. So that tip was no longer this dyadic exchange between consumers and drivers, but something that incorporated the perceptions of TMM companies. And we have examples like P23 and P1 who chose opposing ways to take that into account in terms of whether they tip more or less. And then finally, in this part of the discussion, we talk about difficulties in assessing accountability and complex systems. So TMMs coordinate different actors, restaurants, drivers. It's a logistics operation, but for the consumer, because the whole system is built around convenience, they see very little of that, and there's limited affordances and information available. So there's one surface of interaction where, for P22, for example, where there's an incorrect order, the easiest thing to do in the moment is just to tip the driver poorly. And this mirrors the sort of issue in what Elish describes as moral crumple zones in the case of automated vehicles, where system failures can often, the responsibility for them can often fall on individual actors, in this case, drivers. So another important thing that came out of our data is how TMMs can shape how consumers relate to workers. So Duhaime and Wolzner, in a series of lab and field experiments, actually argue that consumers associate gig workers with greater autonomy and hence a lower obligation to tip. And I think what our study highlights is there are a lot of different factors at play here that can change how workers relate to, how consumers relate to workers. So, for example, the fact that the app prioritizes convenience, the interchangeability of drivers, and also how consumers actually, when they tip in a TMM environment, actually feel like the driver is associated with TMM company, and in some cases, they feel a lower obligation to tip. So I think underlying all this, the interesting question is, how is technological mediation affecting marketplace behavior? And I think what we've seen is that consumer decision making is different in TMMs, and there are distinct aspects of TMM environments that affect decision making that we've talked about. And to conclude, Jackson et al., using an STS concept, talk about this process of stabilization and closure through which emergent technological artifacts and practices take on their more settled and durable forms. And I think what our study provides is a snapshot of how this is taking place in tipping and third-party food delivery. Most participants chose to tip before delivery and not adjust the tips. Many describe a reduced sense of connection to delivery workers. And I think what our study emphasizes is the need to pay attention to how technological mediation is shaping consumer decision-making and how consumers relate to workers. So some of the references mentioned, and then, yeah, we just want to acknowledge the Berkeley XLab and the UC Berkeley Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity for financial support and everyone who's provided valuable feedback. Thank you.